Does fantasy have an identity crisis? Well, let's have a look at these 10 different modern books, and I'm going to ask you to try and guess which 5 of these are fantasy and which ones aren't. Go ahead and feel free to pause the video. So, which ones are fantasy? Well, The Book That Wouldn't Burn is the first book in the new epic fantasy series by Mark Lawrence, described as a fantasy that takes place in a mysterious library. The second book is The Adventures of Amin al-Asrafi, which is a pirate fantasy inspired by Middle Eastern folklore. The third one is This Is Where We Live, which is a fantasy about 2 enemies that share a destiny. The fourth one is A Feather So Black, which is a dark atmospheric fantasy focusing on family secrets and curses. And lastly, the fifth one is Into the Storm, which is a surreal fantasy where a lone prisoner and a guardian have to confront the hidden boundaries of reality and existence. Did you get all 5 correct? Well, I might have played a trick on you, because 2 of the books I just told you were fantasy are actually not fantasy, but hey, how would you even know I was lying? The correct answer is actually that the Hurricane Wars and Darkholme are fantasy, while This Is Where We Live and Into the Storm are not. But most of you probably believed me when I said that This Is Where We Live and Into the Storm were fantasy, because there aren't huge differences between these covers, right? Now, I recently watched an amazing video by In Praise Shadows where he did some commentary on the state of horror book covers, and I realized that this exact same thing is happening to fantasy. So please go and check out the video since it inspired me to make this one. Now, over the past 20 years or so, there has been a real shift towards book covers having really vibrant colors or bold text on the cover. I mean, good examples would be The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington, which has a beautiful white background, one vibrant orange circle, and bold letters. Or we could take The Skyward Wind by Alia Whiteley. The UK cover specifically has lots of different colors and again, big bold letters on it. Now, obviously, I could mention hundreds of examples here, but when it comes to books, I would probably class myself as a book collector at this point, owning hundreds of books, and many of my all-time favorite book covers come from modern designs, and in a lot of ways, I do think a lot of books today are in general more beautiful than they used to be. So just to make it clear, this video is not a critique of any graphic designers or illustrators working on covers, because I genuinely have nothing but respect for those people creating these covers. But I need to say something here. There is a blatant downside to this almost standardization of book covers, and that is that it can sometimes be tough to tell the book's genre just by looking at the cover. So let's go back to the books I showed you in the beginning, and let me ask you, how would you be able to identify what was a fantasy book by the cover alone? Let's look at the fantasy book, shall we? The Book That Wouldn't Burn has a quote by George R. R. Martin on the top, which is probably the strongest sign that this is a fantasy. But that's about it. The Adventures of Amin al-Asrafi genuinely doesn't have anything on the cover that clearly shows it's a fantasy. Or am I missing something here? The Hurricane Wars has a dragon, but it's hidden on the right side and it's very hard to spot. Darkholme is, in my opinion, just a general cover, and A Feather So Black has a dagger, which I suppose is kinda fantasy-ish. But what really strikes me about all these covers is that there are next to no elements on them that make you instantly realize that this is a fantasy book. And that's weird, right? If you walked into a local Waterstones, and for my American friends, that's the equivalent to Barnes & Nobles, you could look at all these covers and not really have any idea what is happening in any of them. I mean, what is the story in any of these books, and what can the reader expect? There is almost no way to tell by looking at the covers alone. Nowadays, no matter if you go to the contemporary aisle, fiction, crime, romance, non-fiction, or fantasy, the covers generally have the same kind of graphic pattern, with vibrant bright colors and bold text. And while you end up looking at an absolutely beautiful cover, it doesn't really give you much of an idea what the book is about, which I think is a shame. I mean, just to hammer this point home, I actually went to Angaroba's website, which is a small press focusing on fantasy and science fiction, and I looked at some of the new releases, and out of these 8 covers, I would only say that one of them actually tells a bit of a story, and that is Ludlud by Steve Bird. Again, don't get me wrong, these covers are beautiful and are clearly made by incredible illustrators and graphic designers, but it's so hard to tell that these are fantasy books. I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but I absolutely love going into secondhand bookshops or charity shops and looking at old fantasy covers. Now, for example, I recently spotted the original covers of Memory, Sorrow and Thorn made by Michael Whelan in a local charity shop. I mean, these covers are absolutely beautiful and they absolutely scream epic fantasy. Another example would be the original Anne McCaffrey book covers. Basically, every single one of them has a massive dragon on it, and again, it just screams epic fantasy. Well, I love a lot of the modern fantasy covers, like for example, The Realm of the Elderlings. The UK cover specifically are absolutely beautiful. I mean, the US cover of Assassin's Apprentice is literally one of the worst covers I've seen in my life, but the UK covers are so iconic and absolutely beautiful, and I wouldn't change it if I'm being honest. But there is something to be said here about these covers, and that is that they are actually not very fantasy-ish, which is usually the covers I gravitate towards. Now, in recent times, I have noticed that it's not the traditional publishers who are embracing the fantastical in their cover art, but it's actually much more the small presses or companies doing special editions. And from what I can see, people are loving those covers. Let's take an example again. If you look at the blade itself, the UK cover, I generally quite like that this one has a map and blood splattered on the bottom of it. But again, if we're being honest, this cover doesn't tell you much about the story. Now, if you have a look at the Curious King edition of the blade itself, cover art made by Tommy Arnold, and it looks absolutely insane. But this cover tells you so much. We have an insane man on the cover, which clearly emphasizes the darkness and grimness of the novel. And also importantly, this cover kind of tells you that this is most likely going to be a character-driven story about a maniac of some kind, right? Now, another example would be the Dragonbone chair by Ted Williams. If you take a look at the most recent UK cover of the Dragonbone chair, then we do kind of have something that does emphasize that this is epic fantasy, but still, the elements are not really heightened, right? Now, if you really want a fantastical cover of this book, then you will hunt down the old Michael Whelan cover, or you'll have to spend extra money on the Grim Oak Press edition or the Brogan Binding edition. And these both covers absolutely scream that this is epic fantasy, and I love them for that. But the only place where you will not get a cover that screams fantasy is in a normal bookstore in the UK, because for some reason publishers have decided that fantasy covers shouldn't be too fantastical. I also do have to mention that I do feel sorry for Ted Williams, since he had Michael Whelan do all his covers for his original series Memory, Sorrow and Thorn, and the covers were absolutely fantastic. Unfortunately, for some reason Michael Whelan was not able to work on the covers for the last two books in the sequel series, which meant that the series had a drastic cover change. If you look at Empire of Grass compared to Into the Narrow Dark, these do not look like they're in the same series. An absolute travesty in my opinion. But yes, covers feel like they're becoming more and more standardized across the board, and I'm sure there are probably reasons for this, probably loads of marketing data to back this up, but the covers I love and gravitate towards are the ones that are unabashedly fantasy. For example, the original Wheel of Time covers made by Daryl K. Sweet are almost famous in the fantasy community for both being beautiful, like the Path of Daggers cover, to being downright weird and cringy looking, like in the Lord of Chaos. But in a lot of ways, these covers really do portray what this series is. I think for the most part, a lot of fantasy cover art had a much more visceral art style that wasn't ashamed of proclaiming that this is a fantasy book. So if you look at the 15 amazing Wheel of Time covers as a whole, then you know what you're signing up for when you're going into the story. Now, I was excited when Orbit announced that they were doing new covers for the series a couple of years ago, and I must say that I was thoroughly disappointed by the new covers. The new UK covers of the Wheel of Time are so horrifically generic in my opinion that it's actually insane. I mean, the Wheel of Time, one of the greatest series of all time, and this repackaging is nothing short of underwhelming. Yes, I know, it is expensive to repackage a 15-book series, but this is not just any series, right? The Wheel of Time has literally sold more than 50 million books. In my opinion, the new UK covers could literally represent 1,000 different books, but that seems to be the way traditional publishing has been going for a while now. There seems to be almost an obsession of moving away from anything that is deemed too blatantly nerdy or fantastical. It makes me a bit sad. Also, don't get me wrong, I don't argue we should go back to pulpy fantasy covers from the 60s, because while those are charming and fun, I can imagine that a lot of potential readers were put off by how strange they were. All I'm saying is that I would love to see fantasy books in the traditional publishing sphere to not shy away from the fantastical in their covers. Now, there are still places you can find book covers that scream fantasy. I mean, again, I've already mentioned the Brogan Binding and other fine presses, but this style of covers are still very much alive and normalized in the self-publishing sphere. So if you take a look at the finalists for the SPFBO in 2022, so that's 2 years ago, I will ask you, what instantly strikes you with these 10 covers? I mean, most of them have a vivid art that focuses on the fantastical elements, and these covers really tell a story. For example, the Umbral Sword by Alec Hudson has two warriors fighting against a badass dragon. A Touch of Light looks like it has a magical tree with a sword in it. Now, I'm not saying that all self-published books have better covers, but it is much easier to identify a fantasy book if you're browsing in the self-publishing sphere than in the traditional sphere, and I think that's a shame. I mean, I'm always pleased when self-published authors are able to gain a deal with traditional publishers, but I do often find it weird how traditional publishers instantly change the covers from something really cool to something generic. Obviously, not always the case, but if you look again at the Shadow of what was Lost, which was originally self-published, the original cover was horrible, and it definitely got an upgrade by going traditional. Let's have a look at some other examples. So if you look at Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter, the self-published cover had a huge dragon spewing fire, while the new traditional cover has an African shield on it. Now, the new cover is still absolutely beautiful, but the fantastical elements are kinda being hidden away. Another example would be the Combat Codes. Here you can see the self-published cover versus the traditional published cover. And in the more recent example, Dungeon Crawler Carl, without a doubt one of the most insane series to date, and the self-published edition had an art style that perfectly fits the book. I mean, there's a freaking goblin riding a tank with nails on it, and Princess Donut is there as well. This cover art is insane, but it tells you a story and it fits perfectly with the overall narrative. Now, most of you probably know that Dungeon Crawler Carl was recently picked up by a publisher in America, and it was given this cover. Again, I want to emphasize, I think that this is actually quite a cool cover, and the illustrator and the graphic designer did a good job here. I just think it's unfortunate that the crazy elements of the story had to be hidden away. Fortunately, there are still some traditionally published covers that are unashamedly fantasy, like the Michael Willen covers for the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, or the Bloodsworn Saga by John Gwynne, and universally, in the fantasy community, these covers are absolutely loved. So, does fantasy have an identity crisis? Well, the stories are still fantastical and epic and filled with dragons, magic, and sword and sorcery and so on. So, the stories? No. But there seems to be a bit of an identity crisis in how fantasy is being portrayed in our bookstores. You know, I love fantasy, and I would love to see others embrace what makes fantasy in their cover art. Now, what is wrong with modern fantasy? Well, check out this video to find the answer. Oh, you're still here and you want more? Well, the good news is that I have a Viking book club on my Patreon. If you join my Patreon, then you get access to an exclusive book club where every single month we read one book together, and the book can be put forward by you. If you join tier 3 or 4, then you can put a book forward, and then I randomly choose a book from the pot that we end up reading together, and throughout the month we discuss the book on the Patreon chats, and then we also have Zoom hangouts, which honestly are some of my favorite times of the month. This month we're reading this book, and next month we're gonna be reading this book. Also, since I launched my Patreon, I basically spent my money back into the channel on video editing. I've had more than 40 videos professionally edited, so if you want to support what I do here and also help me upload more consistently, then I'll leave a link in the description down below.